Hello, in this video, I want to continue the series that we've been talking about with settler colonialism and space privatization. I really think that obviously settler colonialism is a really important criticism for the core of the space resolution, because I just think that the comments that it's making about how we think about space in relationship to ideas of settlement, the idea of being able to come and create like basically a differential way of relating to questions of space, and how space operates as a way to kind of like operationalize various types of like settler fears and desires about like how we're able to relate to the question of like land, and the question of just like creating like new space or having access to free space, etc., is all relevant to like the histories of settler colonialism and deeply entrenched in so many studies about like the way in which we think about the process of not only the creation of particular types of spaces, but also how we alienate ourselves from like humanity as a whole. And so I think it asks a lot of really critical questions about how critical questions about how things like the space resolution choose to investigate like things like new access to different types of space, how it kind of relates to the question of like what the kind of terms are for like how we're able to think about not only like what new space is, but also like what kind of the human kind of is under those conditions. And I think that being able to ask a lot of those questions really specifically in the context of what that means for critical affirmatives is super important, which is why in this section I really want to talk about settler colonialism on the negative versus critical teams. I think that settler colonialism can be a really good strategy within critical debates, because I think that it allows you to really investigate like why there is a desire to like be able to theorize outside the context of like the current land that we occupy or our current relationship to spatialization. And I also think that it like asks a lot of questions in terms of being able to like push the question of like why certain ways of thinking about space that attempt to create a humanity that is kind of like post the one that we are already engaged in, or like these just investigate the idea of the post-human as a whole, are really invested in the evisceration of being able to think about like the role and responsibility that settler colonialism plays in our ability to kind of like think about something beyond human capacity. And so I think that having a kind of like criticism that's able to like point out a lot of these flaws and ask a lot of these questions is super important to a resolution like space, where there will be a lot of really interesting questions about like how people are engaged in the future as a whole. I think that when you're trying to figure out maybe what are some of your priorities when you're reading an argument like this, a lot of the things that I would say are like most important is the way in which you can kind of create a paradigm for being able to give the judge a way to evaluate their relationship to how this affirmative is kind of conceptualizing space. Obviously, a lot of the critical affirmatives are going to try to say that the way that they're thinking about like space exploration is not rooted in settler colonialism or the desire for recolonization, and obviously the burden is on you to disprove that. So I feel like a lot of the arguments that you really want to make are maybe setting up some of the like thesis claims that you'll end up making later on in your framing debate by creating like a debate that's really just about like why spatialization that is not rooted in, or a conversation around spatialization that aren't rooted in the context of settler colonialism, only evading create moves to innocence for those that produce like a particular relationship to settler colonialism that's violent. I think that also when you're trying to think of like what are some of like the questions that are like really pertinent for like the type of offenses you should be dictating, obviously just having a link argument that's just based off of like whether or not their investment in space is like what will kind of create like a relationship to settler colonialism that is violent is like one like really kind of like long line to like have to win every critical debate on. And so I think that being able to build like link diversification from the various ways in which settler colonialism not only operates as an interrogation of how we relate to land, but also the idea and in terms of a lot of space affirmatives where people are thinking about like overcoming the human condition through various forces of science and technology, and how the accumulation of such things can only really happen in the context of like settler dispossession and the ability to accumulate resources from settler genocide, and the retooling of such things will only create the move to innocence that this tech or everything was kind of like worth it in the end in order to create a more moral usage of things like technology, when in actuality the kind of like history that is partaking in is one of like oftentimes forgetting. And I think that being able to kind of like participate in a way of like basically thinking about like why that's super important is like a really strong place for you to start like a lot of the criticism that you would want to make in terms of like how you're developing offense outside of just like the kind of like top level link argument that we've been discussing for a lot of like this video and a lot of the other contexts when we talk about settler colonialism in space. I think that then when we kind of like move into talking about like what this means for specifically the framing debate, a lot of the things that I would say in terms of like what you should be doing for the framing debate is trying to make an argument about like why the conversation around space is basically not just like in a vacuum about the idea of things that are like outside of the Earth's atmosphere. The spatialization is a debate that kind kind of like reaches into like our very understanding of like how we're thinking about not just the dictation of like land, but how like sociocultural changes and shifts rooted in settler colonialism change our relationship to how we're able to even like imagine like what type of possibilities are necessary. I feel like making arguments about like how various like ideas about like how we should reuse the future and retool those things are even if not like directly invested in violent forms of settler colonialism, are still require an analysis that makes like comparative claims about like the relationship that settler colonialism takes up in relationship to them, and why that's critically important for the type of education that we take up in academic spaces, because of like the strong role between like academic like writings about various types of futurism and just the idea of being able to create a particular type of paradigm for like relating to various types of like futurisms outside of like that particular set of studies, and how those kind of like conversations are like aren't disconnected to each other, but all critical framings of like how we're able to think about what material practices are taken in order to act out those features. And so I think that making a lot of arguments about like what is kind of like the educational purposes of those things can like really give your judge like a good reason for why the framing that you're taking up in the context of settler colonialism, even if it's not like, for instance, the most important impact framing over like, for instance, any other, is like a good place for you to like think about like an educational like sourcing for the debate, because the ways in which settler colonialism is just so endemic to conversations around spatialization. And I think that being able to like make that kind of like fundamental connection is really important at the framing basis. I then think that when you go to the thesis portion of the debate, this is where I feel like you need to start setting up your offense early and really trying to like make a lot of the stuff that you're gonna do a lot later on a lot less shallow. I feel like a lot of the stuff that people are kind of trying to do basically in this thesis portion of the debate is find a way to introduce a lot of the concepts that you'll have for like the link debate and things like that you'll use to refute things like the permutation later on, by being able to kind of like win that the way in which various types of the way in which various types of alternative relationships to space that aren't prescribed by policy attempt to basically like see the limitations of like how the human has been able to relate to the earth, and like why the earth is something that we can like no longer be able to save, and whether apocalyptic or whether it's utopian requires us to like move on from the condition of like settlement that is like created like the reason why the earth is failing. And I feel like making that kind of like crux argument in terms of like why they I'm glad that the kind of like crux argument they're making in terms of like why that's particularly true is really important, not only as like a historical question for like how these other studies are kind of like coming to the question of spatialization, but it's like really an important question about like why there is kind of like this desire to move beyond the earth in the first place, and what that means about like the state for like how humans are basically continue the same relations that have like caused a detriment of the earth in other types of paradigms. And I think that in other types of contexts, ideal and this one being, for instance, like outer space, and why that creates a particular repetition of violence that sets up some of the link offense that you would want to read later, and that hopefully is kind of like helpful from the guiding that I've like done in this video in terms of giving you some base ideas in terms of how you should be thinking about this negative strategy versus critical teams as a whole. Hopefully tune into this video and other videos I'll be doing with space colonization and settler colonialism. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in.